The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground, each turn grinding like broken bones. Emma Collins pressed her face against the rough wooden slats, watching the endless Montana landscape roll past in shades of brown and dying gold. The rope around her wrists had rubbed raw hours ago, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She was 19 years old, and she had just been sold like livestock to pay her family's crushing debts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The man driving the wagon hadn't spoken to her since they left Millfield 3 hours earlier. Samuel Crawford was a thin, sharp-featured debt collector who smiled too much and never let his eyes linger in one place too long. He hummed under his breath as he drove, a tuneless melody that made Emma's skin crawl. Behind them, tied to the wagon, rode the horse that would take her to her new life. Or what was left of it. The autumn air bit through her thin cotton dress, and Emma pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had been wearing the same dress for 2 days now, ever since her brother Thomas had shaken her awake before dawn and told her to get dressed. She remembered the look on his face, the way his hands trembled as he spoke the words that would change everything. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you." The memory hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back to that terrible morning. 2 days earlier, she had been kneading bread in the kitchen of their small farmhouse, flour dusting her hands white, when Thomas burst through the door. Her brother was 26, 3 years older than Emma, but he had aged a decade in the past 6 months. Their father had died during the harsh winter, leaving behind nothing but debts and a failing farm that barely produced enough to keep them alive. "Sit down," Thomas had said, but Emma kept working the dough, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm that had comforted her since childhood. "I'm almost finished with the bread," she replied, not looking up. "Martha will be hungry when she wakes up." "Emma." Thomas's voice was different now, harder. "Sit down." She had finally looked at him then, really looked, and what she saw in his face made her stomach drop. There was guilt there and shame, but underneath it all was something worse. Resignation. "What is it?" she whispered, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. Thomas sat heavily at their small wooden table, the same table where their mother had served meals for 18 years before the fever took her. He stared at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of farm work that had never quite been enough. "The bank note came due yesterday," he said quietly. "Miller wants his money, and Crawford came by with papers from the territorial judge." Emma's mouth went dry. They had known this day was coming, had watched it approach like a storm on the horizon, but somehow she had convinced herself that Thomas would find a way. He always did. When their father drank away the seed money, Thomas had worked extra shifts. At the mill, when the roof leaked, he had patched it with scraps and prayers. When their mother fell sick, he had ridden 20 miles to bring back medicine they couldn't afford. "How much?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. $300. The number fell between them like a stone into still water. $300 might as well have been 3,000. It was more money than their family had ever seen at one time. Emma sank onto the bench across from her brother, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What are we going to do?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, so long that Emma began to hope he was still thinking, still planning, still fighting. But when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and empty. Crawford made an offer. The words hung in the air between them, and Emma felt something cold crawl up her spine. She knew Samuel Crawford by reputation. He was the kind of man who collected debts the way other men collected stamps, methodically and without mercy. He bought contracts from banks and businesses, then enforced them however he saw fit. The territorial law was loose out here, and men like Crawford operated in the spaces between what was legal and what was right. What kind of offer? Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended. Thomas looked up at her then, and she saw tears in his eyes. She had only seen her brother cry twice in her life, once when their mother died, and once when he thought she wasn't looking, the day after their father's funeral. "There's a rancher up in Copper Creek Valley," Thomas said slowly, each word seeming to pain him. "Name of Daniel Hayes, been alone out there for near 10 years now. Crawford says Hayes has been looking for—" He stopped, swallowed hard, then forced himself to continue, "looking for a wife." Emma stared at her brother, the words not quite making sense. "A wife? Crawford knows Hayes from some business dealings. Says the man's got money, good land, but he's particular about what he wants. He's willing to pay off our debt in exchange for—" Thomas's voice broke entirely. "In exchange for me." Emma finished the sentence because she could see that Thomas couldn't. Her brother nodded, his shoulders shaking. "Emma, I'm sorry. God help me, I'm so sorry, but I don't know what else to do. If we don't pay Crawford, he'll take the farm, and Martha and I will end up in debtor's prison. At least this way you'll have a roof over your head, food to eat." Emma felt like she was drowning, like the air in the small kitchen had turned to water. "What about what I want? What choice do we have?" Thomas's voice was desperate now, pleading. "Crawford says Hayes is a decent man, not like some of the others who've made offers. He owns the biggest spread in Copper Creek Valley, has a good house, treats his workers fair. It could be worse, Emma. It could be so much worse." The conversation had continued for another hour, with Emma begging and Thomas explaining, and both of them crying until there were no tears left. In the end, the decision had already been made. Crawford had the papers drawn up, and the territorial judge had already signed them. Emma Collins was now property, transferred from her family's debt to Daniel Hayes's ownership, to be collected at dawn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had spent her last night as a free woman, lying awake in the bed she shared with her younger sister Martha, listening to the girl's peaceful breathing and trying to memorize the sound. Martha was only 14, too young to understand what was happening, too young to know that when she woke up, Emma would be gone forever. Now bumping along in Crawford's wagon with her hands bound and her future decided, Emma tried not to think about Martha's face when she discovered the empty bed. Thomas had promised to explain everything, to take care of their sister, but Emma knew that some wounds never healed. She was being torn away from the only family she had left, sold to a stranger in a valley she had never seen. The wagon hit a particularly deep rut, jarring Emma back to the present. Crawford glanced over his shoulder at her, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. "Not much further now," he said, his voice cheerful in a way that made Emma's skin crawl. "Should reach the Broken Arrow by sunset." Emma didn't respond. She had learned not to engage with Crawford during their journey. Every time she spoke, he found a way to make her feel smaller, more helpless. He seemed to enjoy reminding her of her situation, of the fact that she now belonged to a man she had never met. "You're lucky, you know," Crawford continued, apparently not needing a response to keep talking. "Hayes could have chosen anyone, but he specifically requested someone young and untouched. Said he wanted to start fresh, build something clean. You should be grateful." The word grateful hit Emma like a slap. Grateful to be sold, grateful to be treated like merchandise. She bit her tongue to keep from responding, tasting blood. The landscape around them was changing now. The flat farmland of the valley floor was giving way to rolling hills covered in tall grass that moved like water in the wind. Emma could see cattle in the distance, black dots scattered across the golden expanse. This was ranching country, where land was measured in thousands of acres and success was counted in heads of livestock. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma caught her first glimpse of her destination. The Broken Arrow Ranch sprawled across a natural valley, protected on three sides by low hills and open toward a creek that caught the last light of day. The main house was larger than Emma had expected, built from local stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying with it the promise of warmth and food. Surrounding the house were the practical buildings of a working ranch, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Emma could see men moving around the property, finishing the day's work, but from this distance they were just dark figures against the dying light. "Impressive spread," Crawford said, and Emma could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Hayes has done well for himself out here. Started with nothing but a homestead claim and built all this in 10 years. You could do worse, girl." Emma wanted to tell him that she could also do better, that she could have had a choice in her future, but the words stuck in her throat. There was no point in arguing with Crawford now. He had delivered his merchandise, and soon his part in this transaction would be over. The wagon rolled through an open gate marked with the ranch's brand, a broken arrow pointing toward the sky. Emma had heard of brands like this, symbols that marked ownership, that declared to the world who controlled what. Soon, she supposed, she would be marked in her own way, claimed by a man she had never seen. As they approached the main house, Emma saw him for the first time. Daniel Hayes stood on the front porch, one shoulder leaning against a support post, watching their approach with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of practical work rather than show. Even from the wagon, Emma could see that he was younger than she had expected, probably not yet 30. Crawford brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment her old life ended and whatever came next began. "Hayes," Crawford called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Got your delivery here, safe and sound." Daniel Hayes straightened, pushing away from the post, and walked down the porch steps with the measured gait of a man who was never in a hurry. As he got closer, Emma could see more details of his face. Strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, eyes that might have been blue or gray in the fading light, and lines around those eyes that spoke of too much sun. And not enough laughter. "Crawford." Hayes's voice was deeper than Emma had expected, with a roughness that suggested he didn't use it more than necessary. His gaze flicked to Emma, sitting bound in the back of the wagon, and something passed across his face too quickly for her to identify. "She's everything you asked for," Crawford said, climbing down from the wagon seat with obvious satisfaction. "Young, healthy, never been touched. Her brother vouched for her character, and I can personally attest to her compliance." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks at being discussed like livestock, but she forced herself to meet Hayes's gaze. When it returned to her, if she was going to be owned by this man, she would at least look him in the eye. What she saw there surprised her. There was no hunger, no satisfied ownership, none of the things she had prepared herself to see. Instead, there was something that might have been discomfort, even regret. "Untie her," Hayes said quietly. Crawford looked surprised. "Now hold on, Hayes. We haven't finished our business yet. I've got papers that need signing, and we need to discuss the terms of untie her." This time Hayes's voice carried a tone that brooked no argument. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Crawford's smile faltered slightly, but he moved to the back of the wagon and began working at the ropes around Emma's wrists. The moment they fell away, Emma felt blood rush back into her hands, pins and needles dancing along her fingers. "Can you stand?" Hayes asked her directly, and Emma realized it was the first time anyone had spoken to her instead of about her since the journey began. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice, and carefully climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were unsteady after hours of being cramped in the back of the wagon, and she had to grip the wagon's side for support. Hayes watched her carefully, as if assessing whether she might collapse, then turned back to Crawford. "Your papers?" Crawford produced a leather portfolio from inside his coat, clearly pleased to return to the business side of things. "Standard contract, as we discussed. Miss Collins is now legally bound to your service for a period of 7 years, or until such time as her family's debt is considered paid in full. During that time, she's your responsibility for housing, feeding, and clothing. The territorial judge has already signed off on the arrangement." Emma felt the words wash over her like cold water. 7 years. She would be 26 years old before she was free again, assuming she lived that long. Assuming Hayes honored the terms of the contract. Hayes took the papers and glanced through them quickly, his face revealing nothing. When he looked up, his gaze found Emma again, and she saw something in his expression that might have been an apology. "The debt was $300? He asked Crawford. "Plus fees and interest, comes to $347.60. Crawford replied promptly. Hayes nodded, then walked to his saddlebags hanging from the porch rail. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out coins and bills, never hurrying, never showing any emotion. When he returned to Crawford, he handed over the money along with the signed papers. "Pleasure doing business with you," Crawford said, his smile returning full force as he pocketed the payment. "You need anything else, Hayes, you know where to find me." Hayes didn't respond, just watched as Crawford climbed back onto his wagon seat. The debt collector tipped his hat to Emma in a gesture that felt like mockery, then snapped the reins and set his wagon rolling back toward the gate. Emma stood in the growing darkness, watching the wagon disappear into the distance, and felt truly alone for the first time in her life. When she finally turned back toward the house, she found Hayes studying her with an expression she still couldn't read. "Are you hungry?" he asked simply. The question was so normal, so human, that Emma almost started crying. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Come on then," Hayes said, gesturing toward the house. "Let's get you fed." As Emma followed him up the porch steps, she caught a glimpse of movement in one of the windows, a curtain falling back into place as if someone had been watching. She wondered who else lived on this ranch, who else would be part of whatever her life was about to become. The front door opened into a large room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a fire burning low but steady. The furniture was simple but well made, everything clean and orderly in a way that spoke of a man who lived alone and took care of his things. Hayes gestured toward a chair at the wooden table that occupied the center of the room. "Sit," he said. Not unkindly, "I'll heat up some stew." Emma sat carefully, her muscles protesting after the long wagon ride. She watched as Hayes moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time. He ladled stew from a pot hanging near the fire into a wooden bowl, then cut thick slices from a loaf of bread that looked like it had been baked that morning. When he set the food in front of her, Emma realized she hadn't eaten since dawn. The stew was simple, beef and vegetables in a rich broth, but it was the best thing she had tasted in months. She ate slowly, trying to maintain some dignity. Despite her hunger, while Hayes sat across from her with his own bowl, they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the clink of spoons against bowls. Emma was acutely aware of Hayes watching her, not in a threatening way, but as if he was trying to figure out what to do with her. Finally, when she had eaten as much as she could manage, she set down her spoon and met his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears after hours of silence. Hayes nodded, then pushed back from the table. "You must be tired. I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." Emma followed him through the main room and down a short hallway. He stopped at a door and pushed it open, revealing a small but clean bedroom. There was a narrow bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a simple wooden dresser, and a window that looked out toward the creek. "This is yours," Hayes said, stepping aside so she could enter. "There's a wash basin on the dresser, and I'll bring you some clean clothes tomorrow." Emma stepped into the room, running her fingers along the quilt. It was more luxury than she had known in months, maybe years. "It's very nice," she said, and meant it. Hayes lingered in the doorway, and Emma could feel him struggling with something. Finally he spoke, his voice careful and measured. "I want you to understand something," he said. "Crawford may have told you certain things about why you're here, about what I expect from you. But whatever he said, whatever papers got signed, you're safe in this house. Do you understand me?" Emma turned to face him, searching his face for deception or hidden meaning. What she saw instead was something that might have been kindness, though she didn't dare trust it yet. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she did. Hayes nodded once, then began to turn away. But at the last moment, he paused and looked back at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Your real name, not what Crawford called you." "Emma," she replied. "Emma Collins, Emma." He said it like he was testing how it sounded. "I'm Daniel Hayes, but most folks call me Dan." "Mr. Hayes," Emma said, because she didn't know what else to call a man who owned her. Something flickered across his face at that, something that might have been pain. "Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow we'll figure out how this is going to work." He closed the door softly behind him, leaving Emma alone in her new room. She stood there for a long moment, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hallway, then sank onto the edge of the bed. For the first time since Thomas had shaken her awake 2 days ago, Emma allowed herself to truly think about what had happened to her. She was hundreds of miles from everything she had ever known, bound by legal documents to a man she had just met, with no money, no friends, and no way home. But as she looked around the small, clean room, as she remembered the way Daniel Hayes had insisted Crawford untie her, the way he had spoken to her instead of about her, Emma felt something she hadn't expected to feel: hope. It was small and fragile, and she was afraid to trust it, but it was there nonetheless. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the end of her story. Maybe it would be the beginning of something else entirely. Outside her window, she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the soft murmur of men's voices as the ranch hands finished their evening chores. This was her world now, for better or worse, and tomorrow she would begin to learn what that meant. Emma Collins pulled the handmade quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, trying not to think about Martha waking up to find her gone, trying not to wonder if she would ever see her family again. Instead, she focused on the strange comfort of a real bed, a warm room, and the knowledge that for tonight, at least, she was safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations about Daniel Hayes and the life he expected her to live. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma Collins was not afraid of the dark. Emma woke to the sound of roosters crowing and men's voices calling to each other across the ranch yard. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the quality of light streaming through the window. Back home, her room had faced east, and she was used to being jarred awake by harsh morning sun. Here, the light was softer, filtered through what must be trees or buildings she couldn't yet see. Reality crashed back over her like cold water. She wasn't home. She would never be home again. This strange room, this unfamiliar bed, this was her life now. Emma sat up slowly, her body stiff from the long wagon ride and the tension of yesterday's events. The quilt that had seemed so luxurious the night before now felt heavy across her legs, a reminder that everything here belonged to someone else. Someone who now owned her. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. "Emma?" Daniel Hayes's voice was quiet, respectful. "I've left some things outside your door. Take your time." She listened to his footsteps retreat, before getting up to investigate. Outside her door, she found a neat pile of women's clothing, a pitcher of fresh water, and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. The clothes were simple but well made, a dark blue cotton dress, clean undergarments, and a wool shawl. Everything looked new, as if it had been purchased specifically for her arrival. Emma gathered the items and retreated to her room, closing the door firmly behind her. She poured water from the pitcher into the wash basin and began the process of making herself presentable. The soap was a luxury she hadn't experienced in months, and she found herself wondering where Daniel Hayes had acquired such things. Millfield's general store certainly didn't carry soap that smelled like lavender. The dress fit her well enough, though it was slightly loose through the bodice. Emma studied herself in the small mirror above the dresser, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. She had always been slender, but months of poor eating had sharpened her cheekbones and made her green eyes seem too large for her face. The blue dress was a better color on her than the faded brown one she had worn yesterday, bringing out the auburn highlights in her dark hair. When she finally emerged from her room, she found the main living area empty. The fire had been built up, and there were fresh biscuits on the table, along with a pot of coffee that smelled like heaven. Emma poured herself a cup, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic and inhaling the rich aroma. Real coffee was another luxury her family hadn't been able to afford. Through the window, she could see Daniel Hayes in the ranch yard, talking with several men who must be his employees. Even from this distance, she could see the respect in the way the other men listened to him, the easy authority he carried. He gestured toward the barn, and the men nodded before heading off in different directions. Emma found herself studying him more carefully than she had been able to yesterday. In the morning light, she could see that he was probably closer to 30 than she had initially thought, with the kind of lean build that came from years of physical work. His dark hair was indeed too long, curling slightly at the collar of his work shirt, and she noticed that he moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be self-sufficient. He must have sensed her watching because he looked up toward the window where she stood. Their eyes met across the distance, and Emma felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. There was something in his gaze that she couldn't quite identify, something that made her feel seen rather than simply observed. Daniel said something to the man beside him, then started walking toward the house. Emma stepped back from the window, suddenly unsure of herself. What was expected of her here? What were her duties? Crawford had mentioned service, but what did that mean in practical terms? The front door opened, and Daniel stepped inside, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg near the door. "Good morning," he said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I hope you slept well." "Yes, thank you," Emma replied, though the truth was more complicated. She had slept better than she had in weeks, but her dreams had been full of anxiety. About this moment, about facing her new reality in daylight. Daniel moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, his movements economical and practiced. "The clothes fit all right." Emma nodded, smoothing her hands over the blue fabric. "They're very nice, thank you." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with all the things neither of them seemed ready to say. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and gestured toward the table. "Why don't you sit down? We should talk about how things work around here." Emma took a seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Daniel sat across from her, close enough that she could see the small scar along his left temple, the calluses on his hands from years of ranch work. "I know Crawford painted a certain picture of your situation," Daniel began, his voice measured. "But I want to be clear about what I expect from you and what you can expect from me." Emma waited, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. "This is a working ranch," Daniel continued. "I've got 1,500 head of cattle, 12 horses, and 6 men who help me run the operation. It's not easy work, and it's not always safe, but it's honest work. I've built something here that I'm proud of." He paused, studying her face as if trying to gauge her reaction. "I'm not looking for a decoration, Emma. I need someone who can contribute, someone who can handle the realities of ranch life. Can you cook?" The question was so practical, so far from what she had been bracing herself for, that Emma almost smiled. "Yes, sir. I've been cooking for my family since I was 12. Can you tend a garden, preserve food, handle chickens?" Yes to all of that. Emma felt herself relaxing slightly. These were skills she possessed, work she understood. Daniel nodded, seeming pleased. "Good. The truth is, I've been managing this place alone for too long. I can run cattle and break horses and fix just about anything that needs fixing, but I'm tired of living on beans and hardtack. I'm tired of mending my own clothes and eating vegetables that come out of a can." Emma found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension even when he was sitting still. She had been so focused on her own situation that she hadn't considered what his life might be like out here, alone on this remote ranch. "What about the other men?" she asked. "Your ranch hands?" "They live in the bunkhouse," Daniel explained. "They take care of their own meals most of the time, though sometimes they eat here when we're working late or during roundup. They're good men, but they know to respect the boundaries of this house." There was something in the way he said it that made Emma think there was more to that statement, some kind of protection being offered that she didn't fully understand yet. "I want to be clear about something else," Daniel continued, and his voice grew more serious. "Whatever papers Crawford had you sign, whatever he told you about your obligations, the truth is simpler. You're here because I need help, and you need a place to be safe. That's all. Do you understand?" Emma stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "But the debt, the contract, the 7 years." "The debt is paid," Daniel said firmly. "As for the rest, well, territorial law is one thing, but what happens in my house is another. You're not a prisoner here, Emma. You're not property. You're a person who needs help, and I'm a person who can provide it." The words hit Emma like a physical force, and she felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. She had spent 2 days preparing herself for a life of servitude, for being owned and used and discarded. The idea that this man saw her as a person, that he might offer her something approaching kindness, was almost too much to process. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "I suppose because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. "To have your life decided for you by circumstances beyond your control. Nobody should have to live that way if there's another choice available." Emma wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "What happened to you?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, and Emma immediately regretted the question. She was about to apologize when he began to speak. "I wasn't always a rancher," he said slowly. "I grew up in Ohio, on a farm that had been in my family for 3 generations. My father had plans for me, ideas about who I would marry and how I would live my life. When I disagreed with those plans, when I wanted to make my own choices, he decided I was no longer his son." Emma felt her breath catch. The pain in Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, but it was there nonetheless, a wound that had never quite healed. "I was 21 when he threw me out," Daniel continued. "No money, no connections, no skills except what I'd learned working the farm. I made my way west because there was nowhere else to go, worked whatever jobs I could find, saved every penny. When I finally had enough to file a homestead claim, I chose this valley because it was as far from Ohio as I could get." "That must have been terrifying," Emma said softly. Daniel looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. The same fear she had felt yesterday, the same sense of being utterly alone in the world. "It was," he admitted. "But it was also the first time in my life that I was truly free to make my own choices. Good or bad, everything I built here, I built because I chose to build it. Emma understood now why he had bought her freedom, why he was offering her something beyond mere survival. He knew what it felt like to be controlled, to have your life shaped by other people's decisions. "So what happens now?" she asked. Daniel drained his coffee cup and stood up. "Now you learn what ranch life is like. You figure out where you fit in here, what work suits you, what kind of life you want to build. And if someday you decide you want to leave, to go somewhere else or find something different, then we'll figure out how to make that happen." The offer was so generous, so unexpected, that Emma felt dizzy. "You would do that? You would let me leave?" "Emma," Daniel said, and his voice was gentle but firm, "you're not my prisoner. You never were. The only question is whether this place can become home for you, whether you can find happiness here." Before Emma could respond, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see one of the ranch hands running toward the house, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Daniel was at the door before the man reached the porch. "What is it, Joe?" "Boss, we got trouble down at the south pasture," the man called out, breathing hard. "Looks like rustlers hit us during the night. They took maybe 30 head, and they shot 2 of the horses when they spooked." Emma saw Daniel's entire demeanor change in an instant. The gentle man who had been offering her freedom disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. His jaw set and his eyes went cold. "How many men?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. "Tracks suggest maybe 4 or 5 riders," Joe replied. "They knew what they were doing, boss. Took the prime stock and left the rest scattered." Daniel nodded grimly, then turned back toward the house. "Emma, I have to go deal with this. There's food in the pantry, and you should stay close to the house today. Joe, get the boys mounted. We're riding out in 10 minutes. Emma watched from the doorway as Daniel strapped on a gun belt and checked his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before. The transformation was startling. From the thoughtful, gentle man who had been offering her choices to this focused, deadly serious rancher who clearly knew how to handle trouble. "Be careful," she found herself saying, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. Daniel paused in his preparations and looked at her, and for just a moment, the gentleness returned to his eyes. "I will," he said. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone you don't recognize." Then he was gone, swinging into his saddle with fluid grace and leading his men out of the ranch yard at a hard gallop. Emma stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared over the southern hills, and realized that somewhere in the space of a single conversation, her feelings about Daniel Hayes had begun to change. She was no longer just grateful for his kindness or relieved by his protection. She was worried about him, concerned for his safety in a way that had nothing to do with her own situation. The realization was both surprising and unsettling. Emma spent the rest of the morning exploring the house more thoroughly, trying to understand the man who had offered her such unexpected freedom. The main room was comfortable but sparse, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of practical needs rather than decoration. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, mostly practical volumes about cattle ranching and farming, but also a few novels that suggested Daniel Hayes was more educated than his rough exterior might indicate. The kitchen was well organized and better supplied than she had expected. The pantry held flour, sugar, salt, canned goods, and other staples that would have been luxuries in her family's house. There was even a small store of spices that told her Daniel took some pleasure in his food, even if he claimed to live on beans and hardtack. Emma found herself wondering about the woman who had owned the clothes he had given her, about where he had acquired women's things in such a remote location. Had there been someone here before her? Someone who had left or died or simply moved onto something better? The questions multiplied as the day wore on, but Emma tried to focus on practical matters. She made bread, cleaned the house thoroughly, and started a stew that would be ready when Daniel and his men returned. The work felt good, familiar, a way to contribute something useful to this strange new life. As afternoon faded toward evening, Emma found herself watching the southern horizon more and more frequently. Rustlers were dangerous men, she knew. Desperate and often violent. What if something had happened to Daniel and his crew? What if they didn't come back? The thought frightened her more than it should have. She barely knew this man, had been in his house for less than 24 hours, but already the idea of losing the safety and kindness he represented felt unbearable. Just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Emma heard the sound of approaching horses. She rushed to the window and felt relief flood through her when she saw Daniel riding into the yard, his men behind him. They looked tired and grim, but they were all there, all alive. Emma had the coffee ready and the stew hot when Daniel finally came through the door. His clothes were dusty, and there was a cut on his cheek that hadn't been there that morning. But his eyes found hers immediately. "Did you find them?" Emma asked. Daniel shook his head as he hung up his hat and gun belt. Trail went cold at the river. Professional job, like Joe said. They knew the country and they knew what they were doing. He moved to the wash basin and began cleaning the dirt and dried blood from his hands and face. Emma watched him, noting the careful way he moved his left shoulder, as if it pained him. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," Daniel replied, but Emma could see the lie in the tightness around his eyes. Without thinking, she moved to help him, wetting a clean cloth and gently cleaning the cut on his cheek. Daniel went very still under her touch, and Emma suddenly realized how intimate the gesture was, how close she was standing to him. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to pull away, but Daniel caught her wrist gently. "Don't be," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since anyone worried about whether I came home safe." Emma looked up into his eyes, so close now that she could see the flecks of gold mixed with the blue, could feel the warmth of his breath on her face. Something passed between them in that moment, something that had nothing to do with debt or obligation or legal contracts. Then Daniel released her wrist and stepped back, breaking the spell. "The stew smells good," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice, and busied herself ladling food into bowls. They ate in companionable silence. Both of them tired from the day's events, both of them carefully not acknowledging what had just happened between them. But as Emma cleared the dishes and Daniel stoked the fire for the night, she found herself stealing glances at him, wondering what it would mean to truly build a life here, to become part of this man's world, not because she had been sold into it, but because she chose it. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, and as Emma made her way to her small room for the night, she realized that her feelings about Daniel Hayes were becoming far more complicated than simple gratitude. She was beginning to care about him, and that changed everything. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Emma with its normalcy. She woke each morning to the sound of Daniel moving quietly through the house, already dressed and ready to begin his work. He would leave fresh coffee brewing and often a small gift on the kitchen table, wildflowers picked from the meadow, a particularly fine apple from the root cellar, once even a book of poetry that he claimed to have found among his things, but which Emma suspected he had ridden to Millfield specifically to purchase. Emma threw herself into the work of making the ranch house a home. She scrubbed floors that hadn't seen proper attention in years, mended curtains that had been torn by wind and neglect, and coaxed the vegetable garden behind the house back to life. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way that her life hadn't been for months before coming here. More than that, she began to understand the rhythms of ranch life, the way the work ebbed and flowed with the seasons and the needs of the animals. She learned to read the weather in the morning sky, to know when Daniel and his men would return hungry and exhausted versus when they might take their time checking fence lines and water sources. The ranch hands, initially shy around her, gradually warmed to her presence. Joe Martinez, the foreman who had brought news of the rustlers, began tipping his hat to her when their paths crossed. Tom Sullivan, barely 18 and homesick for his family in Colorado, started lingering near the house in the evenings, drawn by the smells of her cooking and perhaps the maternal kindness she couldn't help but show him. Even gruff old Pete Kowalski, who had worked for Daniel since the early days of the ranch, began accepting her offers of fresh bread and preserves with something approaching gratitude. But it was her relationship with Daniel that consumed her thoughts more than she cared to admit. He was unfailingly polite, respectful of her space and her person in ways that spoke of a gentleman's upbringing despite his rough surroundings. Yet there were moments when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something that might have been longing mixed with careful restraint. 3 weeks after her arrival, Emma was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. She looked up to see Daniel and his men riding hard toward the ranch, their faces grim with urgency. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. Daniel swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, already calling orders to his men. "Joe, get fresh horses saddled. Tom, check our ammunition. Pete, send word to the neighboring ranches." Emma dropped the wet shirt she had been hanging and hurried toward them. "What's happened?" Daniel turned to her, his face dark with anger and worry. "The Blackwood gang hit the Morrison place last night. Burned out the family, took everything they could carry, and killed 3 of Morrison's hands who tried to stop them." Emma felt ice form in her stomach. She had heard whispers about the Blackwood gang during her weeks at the ranch, a group of outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months, hitting isolated ranches and homesteads with ruthless efficiency. "How far is the Morrison ranch?" she asked. 20 miles northeast, Daniel replied grimly. "Close enough that we're probably next on their list." Emma watched as the men prepared for what was clearly expected to be a fight. Daniel strapped on his gun belt with practiced efficiency, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of responsibility he carried for his men and his property. "What can I do?" she asked. Daniel paused in checking his rifle and looked at her with surprise. "Emma, if trouble comes here, I need you to get to the root cellar and stay there until it's over. Promise me." The thought of hiding while Daniel and his men faced danger made Emma's chest tight with anxiety. "I could help. I can shoot. Can you?" Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "My father taught me when I was 12, Emma said. We had problems with wolves taking our chickens." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But if I tell you to run, you run, no arguments." The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Daniel positioned his men strategically around the ranch, with clear fields of fire toward the most likely approaches. Emma helped load ammunition and prepare supplies, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed ominous under the circumstances, Daniel came to find her in the kitchen where she was attempting to keep busy by preparing food for the men. "Emma," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up from the bread she was slicing. "What is it?" Daniel moved closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and gunpowder scent that clung to his clothes. "If something happens to me tonight, if the Blackwood gang gets through, I want you to know that there's money hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk. Enough to get you back to your family or anywhere else you want to go." Emma set down the knife with shaking hands. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Emma." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "These men are killers. They don't take prisoners, and they don't show mercy. I need to know that you'll be safe." The thought of Daniel dying, of losing this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness, made Emma feel like she couldn't breathe. Without thinking, she reached for his hands, holding them tightly in her own. "Then don't let them win," she said fiercely. "Come back to me." The words hung between them, more intimate than anything they had shared before. Daniel's eyes searched her face, And Emma saw her own feelings reflected there, the growing connection that neither of them had been willing to name. "Emma," Daniel said softly, and he lifted one hand to cup her cheek. "I never meant for this to happen." "What?" she whispered. "For you to matter so much." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Daniel's thumb traced gently across her cheekbone. Then shouts from outside shattered the moment. Riders coming in from the east. Daniel's demeanor changed instantly, the gentle man disappearing as the rancher and fighter took his place. "Stay in the house," he told Emma firmly. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Emma nodded, though every instinct screamed against the idea of letting him face danger alone. She watched from the window as Daniel joined his men, their forms dark silhouettes against the dying light. The riders that approached were not the Blackwood gang, as it turned out, but neighbors from the surrounding ranches. Word of the Morrison attack had spread quickly, and the local ranchers were banding together for mutual protection. Emma felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she recognized the voices of men Daniel had introduced her to during trips to Millfield. But the relief was temporary. The gathered ranchers brought more disturbing news. The Blackwood gang was larger than anyone had realized, possibly numbering more than a dozen men, and they were moving systematically through the valley, hitting the most isolated and prosperous ranches first. Emma listened from the kitchen as the men planned their response. They would take turns patrolling, watching each other's properties, ready to come running at the first sign of trouble. It was a solid plan, but Emma could hear the underlying worry in their voices. They were ranchers and farmers, not gunfighters, and the Blackwood gang had been terrorizing the territory for good reason. As the neighboring ranchers rode out to check their own properties, Daniel came back into the house. Emma was waiting for him with fresh coffee and a plate of food he probably wouldn't eat, but the familiar domestic gestures helped calm her own nerves. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. Daniel sat heavily at the table, suddenly looking older than his years. "Hard to say, could be tonight, could be a week. But they'll come. Men like that don't leave loose ends." Emma sat across from him, studying the lines of exhaustion and worry etched in his face. "You've dealt with men like this before." It wasn't a question, and Daniel didn't treat it like one. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "My second year here," he finally said. "There was a group of claim jumpers working the territory. They'd wait for a homesteader to get established, then come in with forged papers and false witnesses to steal the land. When that didn't work, they'd use other methods." Emma waited, sensing there was more to the story. "They came for this place in late fall, just before the first snow. 3 men with official-looking documents saying I'd never filed proper claim. When I refused to leave, they decided to burn me out." "What happened?" Daniel's smile was grim and humorless. "I'd spent 2 years building this place with my own hands. I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. When they came back with torches, I was ready for them." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You killed them." "I defended what was mine," Daniel said simply. "Out here. That's the only law that matters sometimes." The knowledge should have frightened her, but instead Emma found herself oddly comforted by it. Daniel Hayes was not a violent man by nature, but he was capable of violence when necessary. In a territory where the nearest law enforcement was days away, that capability might be the only thing standing between them and the Blackwood gang. That night, Emma lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch, the normal creaking of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional call of a night bird. But underneath the familiar sounds, she could hear the soft footsteps of the men on watch, the quiet check of weapons being cleaned and readied. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of her bedroom door opening. For a moment, panic seized her. Had the outlaws gotten through? But then she saw Daniel's familiar silhouette in the doorway, and relief flooded through her. "Sorry to wake you," he said quietly. "I wanted to check that you were all right." Emma sat up in bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "I couldn't really sleep anyway. Is everything quiet?" Daniel nodded, but she could see the tension in his posture even in the dim light. "Joe spotted some riders about an hour ago, but they stayed well clear of the ranch. Could have been nothing. Could have been scouts." The thought of men watching the ranch, planning their attack, made Emma's skin crawl. "You should try to get some rest too." "I will," Daniel said, but they both knew it was a lie. He would spend the night checking on his men, watching the horizons, making sure his defenses were solid. "Daniel," Emma said as he started to turn away. When he looked back at her, she struggled to find words for what she was feeling. "Be careful." Something shifted in his expression, and he stepped back into the room. "Emma, about what I said earlier, about you mattering." "Don't," Emma interrupted softly. "Don't take it back." Daniel moved closer to the bed, and Emma could see his face more clearly in the moonlight streaming through the window. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her heart ache. "I never meant to care about anyone again," he said quietly. "After what happened with my family, after losing everything I thought I wanted, I decided it was easier to be alone." Emma reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Sometimes we don't get to choose who matters to us." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "If something happens tomorrow, nothing will happen," Emma said firmly. "You're going to protect this place, protect your men, and then we're going to figure out what comes next." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender, reverent, and it sent warmth flooding through Emma's entire body. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be here soon enough." After he left, Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the way her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had arrived at this ranch as property, sold to pay her family's debts, expecting nothing but survival. Instead, she had found kindness, respect, and something that felt dangerously close to love. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no sign of the troubles that had kept them all on edge through the night. Emma made breakfast for the men, noting the way they ate quickly and kept their weapons close at hand. The easy camaraderie of previous weeks had been replaced by the focused tension of men preparing for battle. Daniel was checking the defenses one more time when Joe came riding hard from the southern pasture. Emma's heart sank when she saw his expression. "They're coming, boss," Joe called out as he swung down from his horse. Maybe a dozen riders, armed and moving this way with purpose. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "How much time do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Emma watched as Daniel transformed once again into the hard, dangerous man she had glimpsed during the rustler incident. He moved with lethal efficiency, positioning his men, checking their ammunition one final time. "Emma," he said, turning to her with an expression that brooked no argument. "Root cellar, now." Emma wanted to protest, wanted to stay and fight beside him, but she could see that her presence would only distract him from what he needed to do. She nodded and started toward the cellar, then turned back. "Daniel." He looked at her, and for just a moment, the hard mask slipped. "What is it?" "I love you," Emma said simply. The words were out before she could stop them, honest and unguarded and completely true. Daniel's eyes widened, and Emma saw her own feelings reflected there with stunning clarity. But before either of them could say anything more, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. "Go," Daniel said urgently. "Stay hidden until I come for you." Emma ran for the root cellar, her heart pounding with more than just fear. She had finally spoken the truth that had been growing in her heart for weeks, and now she might never get the chance to hear his response. As she pulled the heavy cellar door closed above her, Emma heard the first shouts of the attacking outlaws, followed quickly by the sharp crack of gunfire. The battle for the Broken Arrow Ranch had begun, and all she could do was wait in the darkness and pray that the man she loved would survive. The darkness of the root cellar pressed around Emma like a living thing, thick with the smell of preserved vegetables and damp earth. Above her head, the sounds of battle raged with terrifying intensity. Gunfire cracked like thunder, men shouted orders and warnings, and through it all she could hear the thundering of horses as the Blackwood gang pressed their attack on the ranch. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds of violence above. Every shot made her flinch, every shout made her heart race faster. Was Daniel safe? Were his men holding their positions? The not knowing was almost worse than the fear itself. Time moved strangely in the cellar. What felt like hours might have been minutes, or what seemed like minutes might have stretched into an eternity. Emma found herself counting her breaths, trying to stay calm, trying not to think about what it would mean if the shooting stopped and Daniel never came to find her. Then, suddenly, the gunfire did stop. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the battle had been. Emma strained her ears, listening for any sound that might tell her who had won, who was still alive, whether her world was about to end or continue. Footsteps approached the cellar door, heavy boots on the wooden planks above her head. Emma held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure whoever was up there could hear it. The footsteps paused directly. Overhead. "Emma?" Daniel's voice, hoarse with exhaustion and worry, filtered down through the wooden door. "Emma, it's safe now. You can come out." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She pushed against the heavy door, and Daniel's hands appeared to help her lift it. Sunlight streamed into the cellar, temporarily blinding her, but Daniel's strong hands pulled her up into his arms. Emma clung to him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, breathing in the familiar scent of him, mixed now with gunpowder and sweat. He was alive, he was whole, and he had come for her, just as he had promised. "Are you hurt?" she asked, pulling back to look at his face. There was a cut above his left eye and what looked like powder burns on his cheek, but his eyes were clear and focused. "I'm fine," Daniel said, his hands moving over her face and shoulders as if to reassure himself that she was unharmed. "The gang is gone. We drove them off." Emma looked around the ranch yard and felt her stomach clench. The evidence of the battle was everywhere. Windows in the house were shattered. Bullet holes marked the walls, and she could see dark stains on the ground that she didn't want to think about too carefully. "Your men?" she asked. "Tom took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. Pete got grazed across the ribs. Could have been much worse." Daniel's voice was grim as he surveyed the damage to his property. Emma followed his gaze, seeing the destruction with new eyes. This ranch was more than just land and buildings to Daniel. It represented everything he had built from nothing, everything he had fought to create and protect. The attack felt like a violation of more than just property. "They'll be back," Daniel said quietly, and Emma could hear the weight of certainty in his voice. "How do you know?" Daniel gestured toward the barn, where Emma could see Joe and the other ranch hands tending to Tom's wound. Daniel moved closer to the bed, and Emma could see his face more clearly in the moonlight streaming through the window. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her heart ache. "I never meant to care about anyone again," he said quietly. "After what happened with my family, after losing everything I thought I wanted, I decided it was easier to be alone." Emma reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Sometimes we don't get to choose who matters to us." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "If something happens tomorrow, nothing will happen," Emma said firmly. "You're going to protect this place, protect your men, and then we're going to figure out what comes next." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender, reverent, and it sent warmth flooding through Emma's entire body. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be here soon enough." After he left, Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the way her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had arrived at this ranch as property, sold to pay her family's debts, expecting nothing but survival. Instead, she had found kindness, respect, and something that felt dangerously close to love. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no sign of the troubles that had kept them all on edge through the night. Emma made breakfast for the men, noting the way they ate quickly and kept their weapons close at hand. The easy camaraderie of previous weeks had been replaced by the focused tension of men preparing for battle. Daniel was checking the defenses. One more time when Joe came riding hard from the southern pasture. Emma's heart sank when she saw his expression. "They're coming, boss," Joe called out as he swung down from his horse. Maybe a dozen riders, armed and moving this way with purpose. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "How much time do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Emma watched as Daniel transformed once again into the hard, dangerous man she had glimpsed during the rustler incident. He moved with lethal efficiency, positioning his men, checking their ammunition one final time. "Emma," he said, turning to her with an expression that brooked no argument. "Root cellar, now." Emma wanted to protest, wanted to stay and fight beside him, but she could see that her presence would only distract him from what he needed to do. She nodded and started toward the cellar, then turned back. "Daniel." He looked at her, and for just a moment, the hard mask slipped. "What is it?" "I love you," Emma said simply. The words were out before she could stop them, honest and unguarded and completely true. Daniel's eyes widened, and Emma saw her own feelings reflected there with stunning clarity. But before either of them could say anything more, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. "Go," Daniel said urgently. "Stay hidden until I come for you." Emma ran for the root cellar, her heart pounding with more than just fear. She had finally spoken the truth that had been growing in her heart for weeks, and now she might never get the chance to hear his response. As she pulled the heavy cellar door closed above her, Emma heard the first shouts of the attacking outlaws, followed quickly by the sharp crack of gunfire. The battle for the Broken Arrow Ranch had begun, and all she could do was wait in the darkness and pray that the man she loved would survive. The darkness of the root cellar pressed around Emma like a living thing, thick with the smell of preserved vegetables and damp earth. Above her head, the sounds of battle raged with terrifying intensity. Gunfire cracked like thunder, men shouted orders and warnings, and through it all she could hear the thundering of horses as the Blackwood gang pressed their attack on the ranch. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds of violence above. Every shot made her flinch, every shout made her heart race faster. Was Daniel safe? Were his men holding their positions? The not knowing was almost worse than the fear itself. Time moved strangely in the cellar. What felt like hours might have been minutes, or what seemed like minutes might have stretched into an eternity. Emma found herself counting her breaths, trying to stay calm, trying not to think about what it would mean if the shooting stopped and Daniel never came to find her. Then, suddenly, the gunfire did stop. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the battle had been. Emma strained her ears, listening for any sound that might tell her who had won, who was still alive, whether her world was about to end or continue. Footsteps approached the cellar door, heavy boots on the wooden planks above her head. Emma held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure whoever was up there could hear it. The footsteps paused directly overhead. "Emma?" Daniel's voice, hoarse with exhaustion and worry, filtered down through the wooden door. "Emma, it's safe now. You can come out." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She pushed against the heavy door, and Daniel's hands appeared to help her lift it. Sunlight streamed into the cellar, temporarily. blinding her, but Daniel's strong hands pulled her up into his arms. Emma clung to him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, breathing in the familiar scent of him, mixed now with gunpowder and sweat. He was alive, he was whole, and he had come for her, just as he had promised. "Are you hurt?" she asked, pulling back to look at his face. There was a cut above his left eye and what looked like powder burns on his cheek, but his eyes were clear and focused. "I'm fine," Daniel said, his hands moving over her face and shoulders as if to reassure himself that she was unharmed. "The gand is gone. We drove them off." Emma looked around the ranch yard and felt her stomach clench. The evidence of the battle was everywhere. Windows in the house were shattered. Bullet holes marked the walls, and she could see dark stains on the ground that she didn't want to think about too carefully. "Your men?" she asked. "Tom took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. Pete got grazed across the ribs. Could have been much worse." Daniel's voice was grim as he surveyed the damage to his property. Emma followed his gaze, seeing the destruction with new eyes. This ranch was more than just land and buildings to Daniel. It represented everything he had built from nothing, everything he had fought to create and protect. The attack felt like a violation of more than just property. "They'll be back," Daniel said quietly, and Emma could hear the weight of certainty in his voice. "How do you know?" Daniel gestured toward the barn, where Emma could see Joe and the other ranch hands tending to Tom's wound. Word had reached them through traveling merchants that the outlaws had been captured by federal marshals 3 territories away. Their reign of terror finally ended. The relief had been profound, but it had also marked the beginning of something deeper for Emma and Daniel, the ability to plan for a future without the shadow of constant danger. Their wedding had taken place in the small church in Millfield on a crisp February morning, with Joe Martinez standing as Daniel's best man and the wives of neighboring ranchers serving as Emma's witnesses. It had been a simple ceremony, but the vows they spoke carried the weight of their journey together, of choices made freely and love given honestly. Emma touched her wedding ring, a simple gold band that Daniel had ridden 2 days to purchase from a jeweler in the territorial capital. It felt solid and real on her finger, a symbol of the partnership they had built from the most unlikely beginnings. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. Emma's suggestions for improving the vegetable garden had yielded enough surplus to sell in town, and her natural ability with the ranch's financial records had freed Daniel to focus on what he did best, working with the land and animals. They had hired 2 additional ranch hands and expanded the herd by nearly 300 head. But more than the material success, Emma treasured the life they had created together. Their evenings were spent planning improvements to the ranch, reading together by the fire, or simply talking about their hopes for the future. Daniel had proven to be a considerate husband, always mindful of her comfort and happiness, never taking for granted the choice she had made to stay. The sound of approaching horses drew Emma's attention to the eastern road. A familiar wagon was making its way toward the ranch, and Emma's heart began to beat faster as she recognized the figures on the driver's seat. "Daniel!" she called out, and he looked up from his work with the colt. Emma pointed toward the approaching wagon, and Daniel's face broke into a wide smile. He secured the young horse and jogged toward the house, arriving just as Emma descended the porch steps. The wagon rolled into the yard, and Thomas Collins climbed down from the driver's seat before turning to help a young woman down beside him. Martha had grown taller in the months since Emma had last seen her, her face more mature but still carrying the sweet expression Emma remembered so well. "Emma!" Martha cried out, running toward her sister with tears streaming down her face. Emma embraced her younger sister, feeling her own tears start as she held the girl who had been the hardest part of leaving her old life behind. Martha pulled back to look at her, taking in the changes that months of good food and happiness had wrought. "You look beautiful," Martha said wonderingly. "And you're going to have a baby." Emma laughed, wiping her eyes. "I am indeed." You're going to be an aunt, little sister. Thomas approached more slowly, his hat in his hands and uncertainty written across his face. Emma could see the weight of guilt he still carried, the knowledge that his desperation had led to her being sold. But she could also see that he looked healthier than he had in years, his clothes clean and mended, his face fuller. "Emma," he said quietly, "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Emma stepped forward and embraced her brother, feeling his surprise at her easy acceptance. "You're my family, Thomas. That never changed." Daniel moved to stand beside Emma, his hand finding hers in a gesture of support. "Thomas, Martha, welcome to the Broken Arrow. Emma's told me so much about you both." Thomas studied Daniel's face carefully, and Emma could see him taking the measure of the man who had become her husband. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you a debt I can never repay. Taking care of my sister, treating her with such kindness." "The only debt here was already settled long ago," Daniel said firmly. "Emma chose to stay, chose to build a life here with me. That makes me the fortunate one." They spent the afternoon catching up on the months that had passed. Thomas told them how the money from Emma's freedom had allowed him to pay off their debts and invest in new farming equipment. The farm was finally prospering, and he had even begun courting the schoolteacher in Millfield. Martha chattered excitedly about her studies, about the books she had been reading, about her plans to become a teacher herself someday. Emma could see the confidence in her sister that had been lacking during those desperate months before Emma's departure. As evening approached and the family gathered around the dinner table, Emma felt a profound sense of completeness. The life she had built here had not required her to abandon her past or her family. Instead, it had given her the strength and resources to help them heal and grow. "We brought you something," Martha said shyly as Emma served dessert. She produced a carefully wrapped bundle from her traveling bag. Inside was a quilt, beautifully crafted in shades of blue and gold, that would complement the ranch house perfectly. Emma recognized some of the fabric pieces as coming from dresses their mother had worn, memories stitched together with love and care. "We made it together," Thomas explained. "Martha did most of the fine work, but I helped with the cutting and planning. We wanted you to have something that reminded you of home." Emma ran her fingers over the intricate stitching, feeling the love that had gone into every careful stitch. "It's perfect. Thank you both." That night, as Thomas and Martha settled into the guest room Emma had prepared, she and Daniel sat on the porch steps looking up at the star-filled sky. Emma leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the baby move restlessly within her. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked quietly, his arm tightening around her. Emma considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate morning when Thomas had told her about Crawford's offer, through the fear and uncertainty of her first weeks at the ranch, to this moment of perfect contentment with her family around her, and her future bright with possibility. "I am," she said simply, "more than I ever thought possible." Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Emma Hayes." Emma smiled at the sound of her married name, at the way it connected her to this man and this place she had chosen to call home. "I love you too." In the distance, a night bird called from the creek that bordered their property, and Emma thought about the wildflowers that would bloom there come summer, about the child who would soon join their family, about all the seasons of joy and challenge that lay ahead of them. She had started this journey as property, had been sold to pay a debt she had no part in creating. But through choice and courage and love, she had become something far greater, a partner, a wife, a woman who had claimed her own destiny and built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Emma Hayes settled more comfortably against her husband's side and watched the stars wheel overhead, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.